Good afternoon. Welcome to Race Matters, Cultural Politics in the 1960s. My name is Kamara Holloway, and I'm the project manager for the Romare Bearden Catalog Raisonné. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third installment of this webinar lecture series. Over the course of consecutive Thursdays in September, as we remember the anniversary of Romare Bearden's birth, we turn our attention to race, a chief concern in Bearden's work, particularly during the social upheavals of the decade of the 1960s. This series brings together 4 speakers who will shed light on this pivotal moment in our nation's history and consider how artists like Bearden tackled issues related to race in their work. How did artists from a range of racial backgrounds acknowledge the nation's racially charged history? How did they approach depicting a shifting cultural landscape that was responsive to the African American population's call for sweeping social reform? Today, we're joined by Maya Harakawa. Her presentation follows the lecture, Tomorrow I May Be Far Away by Bridget Cooks that took place on September 7th, and the talk, Romare Bearden, the South and the Southern Black Arts Movement by James Smethurst on September 14th. If you visit our website at wpi.art and click on the News and Events tabs, you can see the recording of these previous lectures in case you missed either of them. You can also learn about and register for our final lecture by Helen Sue coming up next week on September 28th. Following this presentation, my colleague Catherine Huff, who's a researcher for the Bearden Catalog Raisonné project, will take questions from the audience. We invite you to submit any questions that you have using Zoom's Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Let me now introduce you to Maya Harakawa. She's an art historian of the 20th century art of the African diaspora, with a particular focus on the United States. She serves as an assistant professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto. She earned a BA from Williams College and her Master's of Philosophy and PhD from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She has received fellowships and grants from the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Luce Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Getty Research Institute. Her writing has been published by the New Museum, Socrates Sculpture Park, the Museum of Modern Art, Art Forum, and the Brooklyn Rail. She's currently at work on 2 book projects. The first, informed by her dissertation research, is a study of Harlem in the 1960s. The second will be the first book-length study on the art and activism of Benny Andrews. Maya's talk is titled Bearden and Harlem in the 1960s. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much, Kamara, and thank you so much to everybody at WPI for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here and to present some of my research and project from my upcoming book. I also like to thank Sally Fullerton for helping with the setup behind the scenes, and I'm so appreciative to Catherine Huff for our conversation and Q&A at the end of the talk. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. Just give me 1 second while I share my screen. A black and white photograph shows a group of people in hats and winter coats, walking with placards around their necks along barricades that separate them from 2 policemen who monitor their movements. The dark of night obscures their surroundings, but the signs offer critical contextual clues. Harlem, shortchanged again, and again, reads one. Visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art, reads another, with the last word crossed out and replaced by photography. Also, sorry, there sounds like there's a little bit of noise in the background for me. Hopefully that's not too disruptive for you guys. But anyway, keep going. The group was picketing at the now infamous exhibition Harlem on My Mind, the cultural capital of Black America in 1900 to 1968, which opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in January of 1969, the same month that this photograph was taken. While the exhibition marked the museum's attempt to rectify its historical exclusion of African American culture, the signs encapsulate what made Harlem on My Mind immediately controversial. The sign alluding to the replacement of art with photography highlights the fact that the exhibition barely featured any actual artworks. Instead, Harlem on My Mind was a media environment comprised of photographs, moving images, and sound. By reducing Harlem to spectacle, the exhibition perpetuated the very exclusions it was purporting to rectify. The exhibition did not incorporate Black art or Black artists into the history of art it otherwise exhibited, further alienating Black art and culture within a museum dedicated to the collection and display of world art. The other sign referencing Harlem connects the exhibition's curatorial logic to a longer history of dispossession. The reduction of Harlem to a historical object by white curators and museums like the Met, however spectacular, was, the sign suggests, akin to a longer history of dispossession that made Harlem one of the poorest and most deeply segregated neighborhoods in New York City. The exhibition, in other words, added artistic and curatorial insult to a broader political and socioeconomic injury. This sign, seen in the left foreground of the photograph, hangs around the neck of the artist Romare Bearden. Bearden grew up in Harlem after his family moved from North Carolina in 1914 when he was a toddler. A generation younger than the preeminent figures of the Harlem Renaissance, Bearden developed as a young artist under their tutelage, maintaining connections to the neighborhood throughout a career that took many twists and turns through the changing aesthetic and racial debates of the inter- and post-war periods. From having his first solo exhibition in Harlem in 1940 to protesting an exhibition that failed to grasp the neighborhood's historical and artistic complexity almost 30 years later, Harlem was always central to Bearden's artistic development. Normally, art historians discuss Bearden's relationship to Harlem in the 1960s through two phenomena. The aforementioned Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met, and you can see an installation shot from the exhibition here on the right, and the artist's breakthrough development of collage. A work like The Dove from 1964, shown on the screen here on the left, is frequently interpreted as representing Harlem. The changes in scale and material and the dynamism imbued by the proliferation of figures, textures, and architectural details suggests that urban life in the most iconic Black neighborhood in the United States was just as vibrant and multivalent as the people who comprise it. However, discussing Bearden's relationship to Harlem in this way perpetuates the very issues raised by the artist who protest Harlem on My Mind. In The Dove, as in the exhibition, Harlem is representational. It's an aesthetic object rather than a living place with a distinct contemporary artistic culture of its own. I raise these examples not to suggest that Bearden was complicit with the logic exemplified by the exhibition. Rather, I wish to highlight how a limited understanding of Bearden's actual relationship to Harlem at this time perpetuates said logic. My talk today will rectify both of these tendencies. I will attest to the broad impact of Harlem on Bearden's work in the 1960s, and, in so doing, explore an artistic vibrancy that has largely been written out of art history. This, even despite the centrality of the Harlem on My Mind controversy to histories of post-war American art. On the one hand, this corrective is important for our understanding of Bearden's career. While Bearden was one of the most important artists of the 20th century, it is clear that we still have much to learn about the various roles he assumed and the projects he pursued throughout said career, and his larger importance for the history of modern art by extension. But the implications of this corrective extend beyond the career of a single artist. Harlem's reputation as a Black Mecca, a site of congregation, reverence, and excellence, was cemented during the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s and 30s. Photographed on the left here by James Vanderzee, a Harlem photographer whose images were included in Harlem on My Mind, but were presented as documents rather than art objects, emblematizes Harlem's reputation at this time. That is to say, the time of the Harlem Renaissance. It was a site where visual forms, like photography, played a critical role in the formation of new modern Black identities. But by the 1960s, Harlem had become emblematic of the country's ever-worsening urban crisis, a site where racial identity was defined primarily in relationship to poverty and violence. In the national popular imagination, the Harlem Uprising of 1964, the first in many that erupted throughout the country over the ensuing 4 years, seemed to cement Harlem's transformation from Renaissance Mecca to post-war ghetto. Art historians, for the most part, have internalized this narrative in histories of the 1960s, discussing art in New York primarily in relationship to the downtown neighborhoods of the West Village and Soho. And it's important to note that many Black artists played pivotal roles in defining the downtown scene, like Bearden himself, who lived and worked on Canal Street. And in her biography of Bearden, Mary Schmidt Campbell writes that Bearden and his wife, Net Bearden, moved to a loft in the border of Soho and Chinatown in 1957. In addition to living and working downtown, the now famous Spiral exhibition, which Bearden coordinated with Norman Lewis and Charles Alston, artists he grew up with in Harlem, took place on Christopher Street in the Village in 1965. And Spiral is, of course, a major touchstone for Bearden's work in the 1960s, and indeed all of art of the 1960s, with the context in which he first developed his work in collage. But since the exhibition has come up in both of the previous talks in this series, I'm not going to dwell on it so much here. But Bearden was also a central player in the Harlem art scene of the 1960s, a scene that is yet to be fully integrated either in relationship to Bearden's work or the larger New York art scene of the 1960s. While his artistic activities focused primarily on curation, and I'm going to go into those activities in a bit, his work in Harlem opens onto a much wider and diverse array of artists who similarly found inspiration in the neighborhood. These artists don't form a school in the traditional art historical sense, a frame that suggests internal cohesion or a singular aesthetic or even political vision. Rather, they were invested in the various ways Harlem's histories and contemporary realities could catalyze novel experiments in art making that would be appropriate for the challenges posed by decade-defining revolutions in both art and politics. Despite their work's aesthetic and even political heterogeneity, collectively, the artists I will discuss in my talk today challenge the racist assumption that underpinned the term ghetto in the 1960s, namely an overdetermining and negative correlation between race, class, and place that necessarily discounts the creativity and vitality of Black life. And of course, these assumptions are still operative in the use of the term today. In what follows, I will discuss Bearden's work in Harlem alongside the others shown on the screen here, exploring both why and how Harlem mattered for each of them. And I will conclude by thinking more broadly about the neighborhood's importance for understanding of the 1960s, particularly the relationship between art and racial politics in the singularly consequential decade in the history of the United States. In 1964, the same year that Bearden exhibited his first collages at the Courtier Ekstrom Gallery in Midtown, Bearden joined the newly formed Harlem Cultural Council, or HCC, a neighborhood organization premised on the idea of culture as community development. The idea for the council originated at a local Harlem planning board in 1964. The following year, the HCC became a fully fledged neighborhood organization with offices on 125th Street. The statement on the screen here encapsulates the council's guiding values. We of the Harlem Cultural Council see its reason for being and its purpose as a bridge. This is perhaps the clearest way to describe our ideas: to export and import culture, to bring back to Harlem that which has moved out into the world from Harlem and been proven for Harlem to now enjoy. To encourage what is now in Harlem and then take it to the world. To bring people to Harlem to see, hear, and experience what Harlem has to offer the world. To bring to Harlem what the world has to offer and what many residents of Harlem have heretofore been deprived of. This last to be in all areas of the arts, but with primary concentration on the Negro and the ethnic groups now residing in the physical neighborhood, in the physical Harlem, and to forming its past. To afford the people of Harlem an opportunity to be proud of their heritage and contribution to the world. This by the process of seeing, hearing, and learning about themselves. This to be accomplished by coordinating the existing groups and programs and in initiating and stimulating new ones. The overall theme, if any, would be the quality of excellence. The improvement at all times and at all levels of Negro people, and the help and cooperation of white people also at all levels. To involve and utilize all existing types of media and those to be developed in the future. The description of culture as a bridge suggests that the work of the HCC was reparative. The council aimed to reinstate a severed connection between the people of Harlem and various cultural traditions, whether local or global. The larger impact the statement suggests would be twofold. First, to allow Harlem residents to cultivate self-pride, and second, to generate their own sense of collective identity, one that would contrast with various externally imposed ideas of what Harlem was and who its residents were. The council's activities were vast, encapsulating visual art, dance, and music. Two of its signature programs were the Jazzmobile and the Dancemobile, concerts that took place on flatbed trucks that traveled around the neighborhood during the summer, providing free concerts. The choreographer and anthropologist Katherine Dunham coordinated the dance program. Other notable council members included Harlem Renaissance writer and painter Bruce Nugent and Jean Blackwell Hudson, then chief librarian at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Bearden acted as the council's art director and curated 2 exhibitions in that capacity. These exhibitions, which are noted here in red on the timeline that I have on the screen, are often mentioned in Bearden scholarship, but only in passing. Here I've placed them in a timeline with other exhibitions related to Bearden in the 1960s. The 1964 exhibition at Courtier Ekstrom Gallery, the first and only spiral exhibition in 1965, the Harlem on My Mind exhibition in 1969, and Bearden's 1971 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Adding these exhibitions to the timeline, these Harlem exhibitions to the timeline, attests the breadth of Bearden's work in this period, expanding it in terms of activity, curation, and location, Harlem. The first of these 2 Harlem exhibitions, entitled Art of the American Negro, was an exhibition of contemporary art, featuring the work of over 27 artists in painting, sculpture, and collage. And it took place in the Kenwood Reuters furniture store at 144 West 125th Street. There is no excellent documentation of the exhibition, at least that I've been able to find to this point in my research. But Bearden did write 2 articles about the exhibition for the Harlem-based newspaper, the New Amsterdam News. And these texts provide key details, succinctly surveying each of the participating artists and providing information about the exhibition's overall vision. The paragraph highlighted on the screen here is the most illustrated in this regard, and it reads as follows. A salient feature of the paintings and sculptures are what they reveal of the vigor, energy, and freedom of the creators. Not just a crude vitality, but a genuine informed concept of design and color that speaks directly to the viewer. Each artist espouses this vitality in the pursuit of his own vision, making for a wide variety of art. So the point of the exhibition was to highlight the diversity and quality of contemporary Black art, and, giving the setting, give Black people themselves the opportunity to appreciate it. And here on the screen, I just have some examples of some of the works that Bearden explicitly mentions in these articles. And we have a painting by Emma Amos, Faith Ringgold, and Felrath Hines. Hines and Amos are both members of Spiral. And I just chose 3 somewhat at random, but mostly just to attest to the sort of diversity that Bearden talks about in the quote that I read. So the following year, Bearden and Carol Green, who at the time was a board member of the Frederick Douglass Institute of Negro Arts and History in Washington, D.C., and also a member of the HCC, curated a much larger exhibition of Black art under the auspices of the council. Entitled The Evolution of Afro-American Artists, 1800 to 1950, the exhibition took place at the Great Hall of the City College of New York at Convent Avenue and 138th Street. Like the Art of the American Negro, the Evolution of Afro-American Artists featured a wide array of art by a diverse set of Black artists. And here I just have a photo, albeit a blurry one, of the organizing committee for the exhibition. You can see Bearden second to the left, and Carol Green is to his right, and then to Bearden's left, or on Bearden's left to his right, I guess, is Marilyn Mikulski, who was the dean of the Graduate Center, CUNY, who served as the exhibition coordinator. So unlike the 1967 exhibition, which focused exclusively on contemporary work, the Evolution of Afro-American Artists was a historical exhibition featuring work from the 19th century, the Harlem Renaissance, and the 1930s and the 1940s. Despite the exhibition's historical framing of 1800 to 1950, the exhibition also featured works of African sculpture from centuries earlier, as in the Benin bronze on the left, which was on loan from the Metropolitan Museum, and contemporary works of art. The painting on screen here, Confrontation by Merton Simpson, who also showed in the Spiral exhibition, was directly inspired by the 1964 Harlem uprisings, which Simpson recalls in at least one interview. He recalls witnessing the uprisings firsthand. So the painting indicates both the presence of contemporary racial politics and the broad implications of Harlem as a place within the exhibition. The evolution of Afro-American artists was immensely popular. It was a subject of a review in the New York Times and a cover article in Ebony magazine, to name just two high-profile publications that covered the show. Numerous visitors traveled to City College to see the exhibition during its one-month run, and most of the visitors were children, as you can see in the photos here. And in his weekly column in the New York Amsterdam News, Jesse H. Walker wrote that at least 500,000 school children had been to the exhibition, although he didn't offer any evidence to substantiate this claim. Oops, I'm sorry. The exhibition's location at City College underscored a broader pedagogical mission that made it a natural attraction for school-aged children. This is one of the many ways in which the exhibition's Harlem location was beneficial for its overall goal. But it also reflects a reality that at the time, Harlem did not have the type of permanent, long-standing art institutions that might otherwise put on a historical exhibition of this caliber. This question of space and institutionalization points to a central feature of the art scene of the 1960s Harlem. Throughout the decade, artists appropriated pre-existing spaces to support their artistic goals. In so doing, they created new spaces that retained a connection to the communities they were embedded in, even as they were reprogrammed to support the creation and exhibition of art. We see a prominent and influential example on the screen here. In 1963, the Harlem branch of the NAACP hosted an exhibition of art featuring work by artists in the community. Out of this exhibition, a coalition of over 50 artists was formed. Assuming the moniker of the 20th century creators, these artists exhibited their work across Harlem in multiple venues. Here on screen, we see an article in the New York Amsterdam News announcing an exhibition at the County Cullen Library on 135th Street. Branch of the New York Public Library, situated just one block north of the more famous Schomburg Center, the County Cullen has its own reputation as a venue for exhibiting major Black artists. In the 1960s alone, the branch had exhibitions featuring the work of Augusta Savage, Metta Warrick Fuller, and Richmond Barte. There were also exhibitions of contemporary artists such as Benny Andrews, Alice Neal, Joe Overstreet, Sun Ra Arts with performances by Sun Ra, and the photographer Roy Lewis. The artists in the 20th century creators also organized their own exhibitions, most notably a sidewalk exhibition in 1964 that ran along 7th Avenue between 127th and 135th Streets. The following year, a subset of artists from the 20th century creators continued this work under the name Weusi, the Swahili word for Blackness. The group coordinated the outdoor exhibitions until 1971. In 1967, 5 Weusi members founded Numbuya Sana Gallery, House of Art in Swahili, which operated out of a brownstone on 132nd Street. A year later, the gallery expanded into a full-blown artist cooperative for the entire collective, and it eventually became a key educational resource, hosting classes, lectures, and workshops. The artist Kay Brown was the sole female member of Weusi. Brown joined the collective in 1968 when she worked as a printmaking apprentice at the gallery. In early 1971, Brown, along with other women artists who had shown at the gallery, including Dinga McCannon, Faith Ringgold, Carol Blank, and Pat Davis, met at McCannon's studio in Harlem to plan an exhibition of Black women artists. They hoped that such a showing would help their work, which was so overshadowed by their male colleagues, gain the recognition it deserved. The exhibition, entitled Where We At? Black Women Artists, took place a year later at the Acts of Art Gallery in downtown Greenwich Village. The collective moved to Brooklyn shortly thereafter and continued to meet and organize shows together for over a decade, maintaining the name Where We At? But Harlem was a key site of incubation for many of these artists, including Brown, McCannon, and Ringgold, all of whom had long-standing ties to the neighborhood. All three were born and raised in Harlem, and Brown and Ringgold both attended City College to get their fine arts degrees. As the examples here on the screen indicate, their work is notable for its emphasis on the experience of Black women, whether that experience be based in motherhood, in armed revolutionary struggle, or in incarceration. They are thus critical figures for understanding the impact of feminism in Harlem in the 1960s. Another example of a Harlem-based artist collective that built their own gallery was the collective Kamawenge. The collective began informally in 1962 as a group of Harlem-based photographers who met regularly in a primarily social capacity. Eventually, the group expanded, assuming a more formal quality as the primary focus became developing their own photographic work. The name Kamawenge reflected the group's overarching philosophy. Derived from the Kikuyu word meaning working together, it suggests a shared interest and a common goal via the collective diasporic Black identity connoted in their linguistic choice for a group name. The photographer Roy de Carava, himself born and raised in Harlem, was a key mentor, serving as group chairman and then president. The first Kamawenge exhibition took place in 1964 at the Marketplace Gallery, a space operated out of a brownstone on 139th Street, run by Adele Glasgow and Ramona Lowe. The group eventually secured an ongoing lease of the space the following year, unofficially renaming it Kamawenge Workshop Gallery. Like Wayusi's Numbiasana Gallery, Kamawenge's space was embedded in the residential fabric of the neighborhood, blurring a thin line of demarcation between art spaces and the spaces of everyday life. But Harlem would not lack a formal museum for long. In September 1968, the Studio Museum in Harlem opened on 125th Street, in the same building as the Kenwood Reuters furniture store where Bearden's 1966 exhibition took place. The museum's founding was a result of 3 years of collaboration between artists, social workers, educators, and philanthropists, and we can see a photograph of the interracial group of the founders on the screen here on the far left. The primary figure in the institution's founding was the painter Betty Blayton, who in the photograph is second from the right. And Blayton directed the arts and culture program at Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited, or HARU, the social services organization run by the psychologist Kenneth Clark. And just as a side note, it was in that capacity that she gave tours of the evolution of Afro-American Artists exhibition when it took place at City College. As part of her teaching in the program, Blayton brought her students from Harlem to the Museum of Modern Art, where she had made connections with members of the Junior Council. And the Junior Council was this group of young donors who were being primed basically by the institution to eventually become trustees. It was her desire for her students to have an art museum in their own backyard, rather than having to travel to places like MoMA, which, although it was not too far of a train ride away, is still a train ride away, that inspired Taylor to work with Junior Council members to develop the Studio Museum. And it should be noted that Bearden was asked to join the board of the Studio Museum, but he refused because he believed that the white members of the Junior Council who participated in the founding of the museum were involved for their own gain and not for the gain of the community. So Studio Museum was modeled after institutions like MoMA, rather than the neighborhood's pre-existing galleries and exhibition spaces. And the first exhibition focused on the electronically programmed light sculptures made by the artist Tom Lloyd. The New York Times profiled Lloyd, the museum's director, Charles Innes, in an article that described the museum's tripartite programming structure. There was a filmmaking workshop for local children, an exhibition schedule of, quote, documentary and scholarly art shows, and an artist in residence program that would provide artists, quote, with funds and a chance to share their knowledge with Harlem apprentices while creating experimental work for exhibition. This artist in residence program, which is still ongoing, was the brainchild of the painter William T. Williams, who worked at the museum for 2 years. While he was at the Studio Museum, Williams was also part of a collective called Smokehouse Associates, along with the artists Melvin Edwards, Billy Rose, and Guy Ciarcia. Together, they made abstract paintings and sculptures in parks and vacant lots throughout Central and East Harlem. Williams conceived of the Studio Museum's Artist in Resident program and Smokehouse as a pair. Together, these two initiatives reflect a broad investment in finding ways to embed artistic production within Harlem. While the Artist in Residence program maintained the model of a traditional studio and ultimately benefited from the larger legitimizing context of an art museum, Smokehouse's work was premised on an unmediated relationship to art in the larger urban context. Williams was particularly interested in how working outdoors, with and alongside Harlem residents would push his work in directions the studio would necessarily contain. And this refers both to the scale and form of the work and to its potential social impact. Smokehouse then encapsulates many of the themes discussed in this litany of examples. The relationship between artistic production and everyday life, the role of the artist within Black urban communities, and the potential Harlem held for the reconceptualization of artistic practice, among multiple lines. So what lessons can we take away about art, Harlem, and Bearden in the 1960s from these collective examples? First and foremost, it is clear that Harlem was a rich site of artistic practice and community development in this decade. Indeed, these examples show that for the most part, the two cannot be disentangled from one another. This is why the moment of the 1960s is particularly rich for exploring art in Harlem. The decade-defining struggles for racial justice meant that for many Black artists, including Bearden, the stakes of art making had changed, and there was a desire to experiment with both the social function of art and with artistic form. Harlem's historical rooting in the Harlem Renaissance and its contemporary links to the post-war urban crisis made it a particularly fruitful site for this type of multi-pronged experimentation. But by way of conclusion, I want to return to the Evolution of Afro-American Artists exhibition at City College to consider more specifically the lessons that Harlem might provide. In the 1960s, City College had a reputation as a prestigious tuition-free public college. But despite its location in Harlem, the student body at the college was predominantly white. In 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the college's 117th commencement address, Black students made up less than 2% of the graduating class. And to provide even further staggering context, only 36 Black students graduated from the college during an entire decade of the 1960s. The fact of racial segregation at the school would have made the rationale for the evolution of Afro-American artists all the more urgent, and the presence of Black children at the school all the more striking. The exhibition made an art historical argument about the long history of Black artistic achievement. It also made a broader social argument about the right of Black people to exist at an institution that otherwise excluded them. Both arguments, it should be noted, benefited from the college location in Harlem. Less than 2 years after the exhibition closed, the issue of de facto segregation at City College came to a head. On April 22, 1969, Black and Puerto Rican students occupied the South Campus of CCNY for 2 weeks, claiming it the University of Harlem. This act of renaming fully encapsulated the students' demands to the college, that it alter policies and curricula for the benefit of Black and Brown students and make changes that would make CCNY more like Harlem itself. It was only through these types of policies that CCNY could truly be a university of the neighborhood and not just in it. Drawing connections between the interventions of an exhibition and the interventions of City College students crafts a longer line of political action, inclusive of art historical, pedagogical, and institutional change. This is not to suggest a correlation between the exhibition and the student protests, that the former was directly responsible for catalyzing the latter, but rather I want to suggest that thinking them together points to an expanded field of the relationship between art and politics in the 1960s and underscores the essential role that Harlem plays in this type of expansion. Given this longer history of the 1967 exhibition, we can return to the photograph of Bearden that I used to start this talk and consider it and the legacy and the larger history of Black art and politics that it represents with different eyes. Rather than a document of a single protest, the photograph becomes emblematic of the various forms of struggle that cohere in Harlem. Harlem was, and it remains today, a place where fights for art historical and social change are fundamentally interdependent, where everyday people of color are prioritized in these connected struggles, and where the question of what constitutes community is continually contested. This is why Harlem and Bearden's work are so important for our understanding of art in the 1960s. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was wonderful. You have done a great job of bringing this era to life for us through your research and your presentation, and giving us a look into the realities of a working Harlem artist then. Some of the pictures you presented also really brought me right there. So thank you for sharing them. I certainly have questions for you, and I know the audience might as well. So as a reminder to everyone, please take the time to submit your questions to Maya in the Q&A feature right now. And we'll see how many we can get to. We have some time. We have about, what, 15, 20 minutes? So I would love to get started with a question, Maya.
That's great.
So you brought up the Studio Museum. Creative centers like the Studio Museum were opened in the late 1960s in Harlem. And I began wondering, how was the Studio Museum met by the downtown art scene that we talk about really holding the attention of art historians and curators then?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for taking the time, both you and the other people in the audience, to formulate such thoughtful questions. So a lot of the historicization around the Studio Museum has focused on the sort of negative reaction that it got from people within the Harlem community. So Tom Lloyd's sculptures, which I showed some examples kind of them in the slides. You can see they're very abstract, minimalist forms with, what you can see in the photos is that they have this light feature to them. And at least the way that they've been written about, or the opening of the Studio Museum is written about, as they were sort of seen as not Black enough, or they were sort of, people within the community had a very negative reaction to them. This sort of led to an overhaul in the museum's structure. Within, I think, maybe 1 or 2 years, there was a new director, and many of the junior council members who were involved were no longer involved, and it was this sort of very early upheaval. But your question is not about that. It's about something different, which is, how would it have been seen within the downtown art scene at the time? And I only preface with that whole context because it really focuses on the institution as being sort of insularly about the responses happening from the neighborhood. But I think, although I can't answer the question specifically in terms of having, an archival basis or knowledge, I'd have to do more research about that. I will say that one of the things that I hope to accomplish with my research is to sort of break down this distinction between uptown and downtown artists. And I think that Bearden is a really important figure from which to do this. I talked about how he has his studio on Canal Street. He's very much part of the West Village scene, as attested to by Spiral, but he's also working in Harlem at the same time. So is Bearden a downtown artist? Is he an uptown artist? This is similar with somebody like William T. Williams, who I mentioned, who started the Artist in Residence program, who was a member of Smokehouse, and Melvin Edwards, who also was part of Smokehouse. They both had their studios downtown in Soho, and they were very adamant about that sort of positioning. So there are other artists, they're another example of artists who break down this sort of distinction between the two. So I think that's not really a specific answer to your question, but it does point to the fact that something like the Studio Museum and the artists associated with it, artists who choose to be associated with it or not associated with it, in terms of Williams and Bearden's differing relationships to it, they suggest that maybe we need to completely rethink, how we understand where this institution, how this institution's geographic situating, what its publics are, who the people are, and how we can sort of craft different geographies of artistic practice in New York in the 60s, which I hope is the larger implications of my research.
Great. Well, then I think I will further try to break down a question then between uptown and downtown. In preparing for this presentation, I'm sure you had the opportunity to look at a lot of different Bearden works, which matches with all of the other creatives that you've learned about in your research thus far. So in the 1930s and 40s, before he moved downtown, Bearden had a studio above the Apollo Theater. Right. In Harlem, and there he was surrounded by a lot of other creatives. So writers like Claude McKay, artists Jacob Lawrence, lesser known artists that we're still learning a lot more about, like brothers Morgan and Marvin Smith. So his studio was really serving as this rich ground for inspiration for other creatives. In your research so far, and answer this however you will, what other contemporary creative influence to Bearden's time from other visual artists or writers or musicians might you see in Bearden's work when you look at it? And on the flip side, where might you have found Bearden in other creatives' work?
Thank you so much for that question. I was just taking some notes down because you were helping me actually. Your comments really helped me think through something that I'm hoping to talk about more when I flesh out my chapter on Bearden, which is, he has this work that was part of the 1971 retrospective, The Block, which is this mural sort of sized collage. It's in this medium of collage, the idiom of collage that he's developing in the 60s. And then it takes on this wall size frame, and it has an audio component to it. So your question about, the sort of cross fertilization between multiple types of artists or different art forms made me really think like, oh, maybe that's a way to read his experience on 125th Street onto this work in terms of it being about creating a space, a multisensorial space across different sort of across sight and sound. That could be a really nice way to sort of think about a through line of Harlem in his work from his time at the studio on 125th Street to that work. But again, that's not really an answer to the question that you posed. But I think, one of the really important influences for the exhibition that the chapter in my book that is really on that City College exhibition, the evolution of Afro-American artists. And one of the influences a major influence on that exhibition for Bearden, and that's something that I'm still researching, is the work of James Porter. So Porter being an artist and a professor at the time at Howard, and he wrote one of the first what we might call of like textbook art histories of Black art. And he put on an exhibition of 19th century Black artists at Howard in DC. And this was sort of like the inspiration, it's unclear to me if it was really Bearden's idea or if it was Carol Green's idea to do the exhibition. But anyway, that's potentially neither here nor there, but it was a really major source of influence for Bearden. So for the exhibition, I should say. So, they're similar in the sense that both Bearden and Porter are primarily artists who then sort of take on this art historical role. I think this exhibition is really important as an early catalyst for the book that Bearden eventually writes with Harry Henderson, and sort of how he assumes a sort of role as an art historian, a historian of Black art. And then they're also taking on these curatorial roles. So this sort of pronged Black artist identity is something that, if he's not explicitly saying Porter was the influence for, there's clear correlation. That it also, I think, leads to this really interesting discussion of the sort of, again, multivalent identity of Black artists at this time. But in terms of the question of who maybe Bearden was influencing, that's actually something that I don't know as much about, or I don't have right at my fingertips, so I have to think more about that.
Well, that's the purpose of questions too. It gives us ideas to think about for future research.
Yeah,
Here is a question from our audience. What was the outcome of the Harlem Cultural Council? Was it a lasting structure for the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as this is one of like these rabbit hole / dead end archival things that I've encountered in my research, in the sense that it's just been, there's no one singular archive for the Harlem Cultural Council, and I've been trying to dig as much as I can in various places, see if I can learn more about it. So that's all just to say that it's very difficult I've had to piece together what the history of the organization was in a piecemeal kind of way. So I don't know for certain, I don't have the firmest grasp on what its longevity was or what its organizational structure was, but my understanding is that it persisted at least through the 70s. And Jean Blackwell Hudson from the Schomburg, who's the chief librarian at the Schomburg and a major cultural and political figure within Harlem, was involved throughout. And I know that she retained a major role. So there are files in her archive at the Schomburg that date at least through the 70s and maybe even into the 80s. So it definitely had longer legs, but I'm hoping to do more research to hopefully learn more about it.
Great. Another audience question. Thank you so much, Maya, for your rich talk. Could you speak to how some of these curatorial, organizational, or political dynamics might formally manifest in Bearden's work? I'm thinking of his collages from the 60s, for example, as a kind of negotiation between image sources or cultures.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that like the way that the collage aesthetic is normally framed is it's a sort of like bringing in not just various image sources, the various different image sources, different scales, sort of like creating this sort of polyphony between within the work. So the question is, the curatorial is like formally manifest. I see. So this is sort of thinking about the other way. Like, can you read, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, can you read the curatorial logic back onto the work as in the curatorial logic having sort of like its own heterogeneity that might be read back onto the work? I haven't thought about that. But it is interesting in the sense that, right, because I did mention how the curatorial logic for both of the shows sort of wasn't about pinning down one aesthetic for Black art. It was sort of saying like, here are all, and like that the multiple aesthetics present or the multiple approaches present were in itself the power of the argument, right? That like Black art can be all these different things, and Black artists have succeeded in all these various different forms or modalities, and that's why we need to take these forms seriously. So I have to think about that a little bit more, but it's an interesting question.
We're throwing you with some tough questions.
No,
Okay, well, here's maybe a little bit more of a fun and easier one. I think especially for us, you know, younger art historians that didn't live during that period, we thrive when we can see these, you know, like sort of cultural artifacts from the time, whether it's art or reading a book from that period or seeing a documentary. And I'm thinking in particular of Summer of Soul, the documentary that came out about the Harlem Cultural Festival. So from your perspective, what else could we as viewers experience in art or media or literature to understand the vibrancy of this era in Harlem?
Yeah, obviously the Summer of Soul is amazing. If people haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And I think that it's just a testament to one of the things that I was trying to push in the talk is how much it was creating art in Harlem at this time was about creating art with a very particular public in mind and creating sort of access, but not access as a goal in and of itself, but within a larger sort of political understanding of, you know, the politics of the time in terms of civil rights and Black Power movement. So I think that there's a really interesting correlation between something like the festival that's in Summer of Soul, which takes place, you know, in a park, and there are so many people there, and it's just like a couple days of congregation, and then something like the Way You See outdoor exhibitions that I profiled very briefly in the talk. They have a similar logic of saying, instead of instantiating these types of cultural products, for lack of a better word, within sort of institutionalized and literally enclosed or indoor spaces, what would happen if we brought them outdoors. So there is a suggestion, even though they're different in terms of one being music and one being art, and also different locations within Harlem, there does suggest that there is this interest to sort of bring culture out towards the people. And I know that there are urban historians of New York in the 60s that are sort of thinking about this phenomenon more broadly. It's not exclusive to Harlem, but again, I think what makes Harlem so interesting in the 60s is the larger context of the racial politics and Harlem's own history in relationship to art. Its reputation, you know, it has sort of this vaunted singular reputation within the African diaspora and really within the world as this sort of quintessential Black neighborhood, and how much art is central to that reputation. So even though there was this sort of, again, it's sort of a larger reconceptualization of who should have access to art and where art should be presented. Also, Dance Mobile and Jazz Mobile are indicative of this as well, and maybe even our earlier history to the Summer of Soul concert. That there's something particular about Harlem that would inflect that.
Right. I really liked that you showed the pictures of Tom Lloyd's art, and he's been an example of an artist for me where, you know, information is more sparse on him. It's sometimes harder to learn about an artist like Tom Lloyd. And we got a question here that asked, you mentioned your archival research, and I'm wondering if you could talk more about how information about Black art from this time is recorded or preserved both formally and informally, and any challenges or triumphs you've had with your research.
Yeah, what a question.
Right.
So to the example of Tom Lloyd, I mean, I know that Krista Thompson, our historian, is writing a book on him, and it's precisely about this sort of question of archival presence or absence in how you write particular types of histories. So that's something that I know I'm very much looking forward to, and I think she's going to deal with this question very explicitly. But just in general, in terms of my own research, I mean, I sort of alluded to this when I was talking about researching the Harlem Cultural Council, which is something that, you know, they were established organization. They came out of a pre-existing city-based structure. So you would think that in terms of the planning boards, you would think that it would be relatively, that there would be a paper trail, and there just isn't. And that really is indicative of a lot of the artists and exhibitions and whatnot that I look at in the project. You know, in terms of researching the Bearden's exhibition, I've found most of the material in Carol Green's papers, which luckily are at Emory University at the Rose Library. But you can see how much I leaned on contemporary periodicals. Like, thank God that the New York Amsterdam News exists, because that's really the best resource there is for documenting a lot of the culturals going on, because it wasn't like it's not like this is one of the benefits, and I think why, you know, institutions like museums like the Met and MoMA and even the Studio Museum, although their archival history has its own history, but it's easier to research exhibitions or that are affiliated with those institutions because they keep their own records. And for so many of these artists who are working in spaces like a furniture store or at City College, to name the two examples of Bearden's exhibitions, they're not keeping their own records. So it's incumbent upon the people at the time to say, oh, I think that these records are worth preserving and whatnot. So it can be quite a challenge. In terms of the Bearden exhibition, like I said, the New York Amsterdam News was an amazing resource. Carol Green kept his own papers, and something that I'm hoping to do is to go, because the Harlem Cultural Council got funding from the state, from the New York State Council on the Arts. So I'm hoping that maybe some of their records will have, proposals or something to sort of see how the exhibition was framed in that context. But like things like installation shots don't really have those, except for the shots that were in ebony. That's like the best example, but it's quite difficult. But I will say that my favorite archival piece that I was able to find in relationship to the Bearden, to the City College exhibition, was the poster. I had it on one of the slides, and unfortunately you can see my iPhone shadow kind of over it because I took
how it goes sometimes. I think we've all been there.
Yes, I tried so hard to get it straight, and it just wasn't. But that was one of the coolest things that I found. It had a print on it by Charles White that was really amazing, and it just sort of proved to me that like this exhibition was real, and like, for lack of a better word, that like it was important. Like, obviously Bearden is a major artist, but like Charles White is like such a huge artist for the history of Black art, and that like and at the time was making unbelievably moving and works about contemporary racial politics. And so the fact that like he lent his work to be on this poster that then would have been advertising the exhibition, it just really was like, oh, this exhibition was really meaningful, and it was a major exhibition, even though it didn't take place at a major museum. So that was really exciting.
How about one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we mentioned the Harlem Cultural Center, you mentioned Waisi Gallery, the Kamwenge Workshop. What are some other examples of creative centers in Harlem that existed during this decade that were meant to bolster the Harlem art community with creative support, critical support, exhibition and performance spaces? Are there any that kind of popped up that you were surprised to learn about, or really like piqued another avenue for your research?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think on the one hand, sort of as you alluded to in your question about Summer of Soul, like focusing just on visual arts is some way limiting, right? Because as we also know, this is the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance as well, that there are so many art forms that are so important to our understanding of Harlem's history. And this is really incorporated into or encapsulated in the Harlem Cultural Council, that it really was about dance and music and visual art. So theater was extremely important. The Black Arts Repertory Theater that was run by Amiri Baraka, and was really, as this was just one example of this extremely vibrant Black theater scene that was that took place in Harlem in the 1960s. Baraka, of course, another really interesting figure that's sort of moving across multiple spaces within New York and making particular choices about where he wants to locate his practice in the city based on sort of a changing political ideology. There's also the Olatunji Center, which was a music, dance. I mean, it was kind of just like a broad cultural center that wasn't explicitly focused on visual art. That was also really important in Harlem at the time. So I think it just, hopefully the project is not about, you know, a complete, fully comprehensive survey of Harlem culture in the 1960s. I just don't think that that's possible for one book to accomplish. So my hope really is sort of like, as you said, Catherine, that, you know, this will just be the start of other people writing more about art and culture in Harlem. The theater piece, because of Baraka, has received more attention historically, and the stuff around the Student Museum is well-trodden territory, but these other pieces there's still so much to explore, and I'm sure that there are other things also that I didn't cover in this talk in terms of artistic practice that are, you know, really would produce completely different ways to think about this period that I think would be really exciting. So I hope that people take that up and continue this work going forward.
Well, with that, I think you're off the hook, Maya. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
It definitely added another layer to this series where we're considering the cultural politics in the 1960s. So thanks again for spending time with us today. As a reminder to our viewers, this conversation has been recorded and it will be up on our website shortly for you to share or watch again, think back on. Remember, next Thursday, please tune in at 1 p.m. On Thursday and join us once again for the last webinar in the series with Helen Su from the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, who will present examples of Rauschenberg's collage art from the 1960s that, quote unquote, crystallize the decade's cultural reckonings and historical crises. Please go to wpi.art and learn about the progress that we're making on this ambitious endeavor of the Romare Bearden Catalogue Raisonné. So bye for now. Thank you, everyone.